Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for finding the time to sit down with us here.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me jump straight into the questions, which is, so are the NATO embassies, such as yours, spreading LGBT propaganda here in Slovakia? Is that your mission?
That's absolutely not our mission. NATO is a defense alliance. It's a collective defense alliance, and we are there as a member of NATO working with other NATO members to support each other in our defense. We have nothing to do as NATO with LGBT issues. We believe in equality. We believe in equality between men and women and people of different sex and gender, but that is, in the end, a discussion for each individual NATO member to have within its own parliament, within its own debates, and possibly for European Union members also within the framework of the European Union, because countries have all signed up to certain commitments. But NATO has nothing to do with LGBT propaganda, LGBT issues at all. We're about defense and security.
Is there any other propaganda that you're then trying to push through, like that we should become maybe a part of your empire again? Are you trying to widen our empire through NATO?
So I always think when people talk about the British Empire, we're proud of the British Empire, we're proud of our legacy, but that's history. That's a long time ago. And in a way, NATO was founded after World War II to provide collective defense amongst a coalition of equal democracies. It's about every country around the table having the same say, the same weight of vote, whether you are Slovakia or whether you are the United States. Different countries bring different things to the table, and some bring more and some bring less, but in the end, it's a coalition of equals working together, protecting our democracies. And that's a critical word, democracy. But it's about equal say, equal matters, equal defense.
So please explain that to me a bit more, because we can be talking about equality, but someone that I would be talking to in Slovakia who would be doubtful or skeptical about what you just said could say that, look, Slovakia has the population of not even London. How can we be equal partners? How can you say that, or the US or you or UK or Germany say that we are equals, we as Slovakia are equal to you? How does that transform?
I think maybe you can look at it rather like a family. And often actually NATO talks about the family of NATO nations, of democracies. Now you may have two brothers. One brother may be 2 meters tall, lots of big muscles, walks around with a big stick. Another brother might be like me, wearing glasses, maybe only 1.50 meters, not like me, and has focus on intellectual pursuits. Okay, but you're brothers, and you support each other, and you bring your different capabilities. If the two brothers, if you're walking down the street and you get attacked, well, maybe you might want the big brother to stand up and protect the little brother, but it may be the little brother who is the one who's really quick calling up for support on the mobile phone. So they both bring different things to the table, equally valid and equally important. And I think that's, in a way, the way it works with NATO. Of course, as an alliance, we need the support of the major contributors, and the United States is a critical factor in that as a major contributor, as the world superpower, if you like. But the United States can't do it on its own. It is very aware of that, and it needs that alliance of countries who share intelligence, we share knowledge, we share capabilities, we work together in order to tackle common threats. Mm-hmm. So we operate like a family, and like a family we stick together.
You're talking a lot about alliances. What would you say, or how would you actually define an alliance?
Alliance is a coming together of countries that have common values and common aims. The number one aim in this sense is collective defense and security. There's a great phrase, famous phrase that comes from the Dumas books, the Three Musketeers or the Four Musketeers, all for one and one for all. That means that we all are together supporting the weakest of us, and each one of us has responsibilities to everybody else. That's fundamentally what alliance is about. We're all for one, we're one for all, we're working together, and we commit to the support and defense of each other.
Okay, but explain to me then, why would such big countries, UK, the US, Germany, Netherlands, want to be allied with such a small country like Slovakia? What benefit does it bring you, actually?
So I think that's where the word democracy is really important. We believe in defense of the importance of democracy as the best and fairest way of managing our political affairs. We recognize that there are threats to democracy out there. Some of those are state threats, authoritarian states that wish to undermine democracy. There are also non-state threats, be it from terrorism or other forms of non-state actors. And I think that we recognize that we can't. It goes back to what I was saying about bringing different things to the table. Now, the United States knows that on its own, without supporters out there, it can't deal with all the threats that it faces. It doesn't always have the complete picture. It maybe has half the puzzle, not all the other pieces. We know that as United Kingdom, we can't do these things on our own. We have seen democracy since 1989. We've seen democracy be reinforced across Europe. And for us, that is a national interest, that democracy itself is stronger in more and more countries. So it is in entirely our interests to support a country like Slovakia. We would expect that Slovakia would see it as it's in interest to both have that support from other strong democracies and also to consolidate its own journey that it's been on since 1989. In the end, it is about values. That's why I keep emphasizing democracy. And that goes beyond simply a narrow national interest of a big country or a small country. Mm-hmm. I also think that we live in a world that has rules. We live in a world where we want the maximum number of countries to accept the democratic rule book, because that is the guarantee of a world without chaos, a guarantee of a world where military adventurism doesn't rule, and even particularly where the rule that might is right is not something that prevails. That's especially important for small countries. We get that. A big country like the United States gets that, particularly important for a country like Slovakia. So there are lots of reasons why it's good for us to be working closely with a country like Slovakia, or indeed Latvia, or Lithuania, or Bulgaria, or wherever that is. And we think it's good for them, and a country like Slovakia, to be working closely with us too.
A lot of people in Slovakia would say that NATO is actually not a unifying coalition of countries, but a destabilizing one that is trying to expand its territory, that is trying to maybe attack Russia somehow. What would you respond to that?
I think the critical thing to understand about NATO is that no country joins NATO. No country is forced to join NATO.
So you didn't force Slovakia to join NATO?
No, I remember this very well because I was a diplomat here in the 1990s, and the United Kingdom was the lead embassy in working to help Slovakia, at Slovakia's request, to prepare itself for membership of NATO. So Slovakia came to NATO and said, we would like to join NATO. How can we do it? And as an embassy, we worked very closely with Slovakia on the political side and on the military side to help prepare Slovakia to join NATO. I think it's one of the most extraordinary things about NATO, that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's an alliance of democracies. So no country has to join NATO. And in fact, interestingly, Sweden and Finland are two historically neutral countries, especially Sweden, which has been neutral for 200 years, made their own choice, to the surprise of other NATO members, I have to say, to join NATO. Why? Because they recognize that they would be safer within the NATO family, within the NATO alliance, at a time when their neighbor, Russia, was being especially aggressive, and after the illegal invasion of Ukraine. NATO began, United Kingdom was a founding member of NATO. It began as a voluntary organization of states coming together for collective defense. That essential basis of the NATO foundation has not changed. If NATO has expanded, it is because countries have seen how successful it has been, and that they feel safer to be within that broader alliance of countries, of democracies, than outside. One could argue that it's more complicated for NATO to have more members, because that means more discussions, more negotiations, because NATO works on the basis of unanimity. And there is, of course, this almost sacred guarantee, collective guarantee we make to each other, that if you are attacked, we will come to your defense. So that's a major issue for us. But no country is forced to join NATO. Perhaps just one other little historical note. Perhaps some Slovaks have memories of the Warsaw Pact.
They do.
The old sort of Soviet-led military alliance. Unlike NATO, Warsaw Pact only ever attacked its own members in order to force them to remain members of the Warsaw Pact. So entirely different philosophy. One, a coercive, rather aggressive alliance that forced members to remain members and didn't allow them to make choices. The other, a defensive alliance which is entirely open to the decision of its own members whether they wish to join in the first place, or indeed if they wanted to leave.
And do you think that actually joining of Sweden and Finland into NATO is not exactly the type of offensive provocation to, let's say, Russia or China, and that they would consider exactly like a confirmation of NATO being expansive and trying to include all nations around Russia into it eventually?
So nobody in NATO was lobbying for Finland and Sweden to join.
How can you tell?
Entire respect because Sweden has been, as I said, a neutral country, for example, for 200 years. It was comfortable with that neutrality, and NATO as an organization was comfortable with Sweden being a friendly but neutral country. But Sweden took that democratic decision to join because of the threat they perceived from Russia. In a way, Sweden's application to join was a surprise. But again, if a country wants to join NATO and meets the criteria for join NATO, and indeed will strengthen NATO as a defensive alliance to protect democracy, particularly in Europe and in the Euro-Atlantic area, it's not for NATO to say, you cannot. We say, are you sure that is your democratic choice? Then you're welcome. If it increases our collective security, then any country which wishes to join NATO is welcome to do so. Of course, there are broader strategic issues that NATO has to address. But I think it's really wrong to talk about NATO expansion as if somehow there's this sort of organic push from within NATO to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Countries come knocking on the door of NATO, and then we open the door if we think they will add to NATO's to our collective security. That's a very, very different process from other alliances in history. And I think one of the reasons why NATO is, in that sense, the most successful alliance in history, with its 70 years of life, and is that it spends a lot of time listening to its own members. Because, I go back to values, we're an alliance with democracies, and that can only work if everybody wants to be in the room.
What would happen to this alliance, or would it still be called an alliance if Slovakia a couple of years from now, decided to leave NATO, how would the relationship change between Slovakia and the UK?
So, and we value Slovakia as a member.
Would we be, first of all, able to do it, actually?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you force us to stay there or, attack us militarily?
No country is forced to be a part of NATO. Austria is a neutral country. Switzerland is a neutral country. Nobody is saying to Switzerland or Austria, you have to become a member of NATO today. Ironically, Switzerland and Austria's security is greater because they happen to be surrounded by NATO countries. And I think they recognize that absolutely. Again, NATO as an alliance is perfectly comfortable with Switzerland or Austria not being members. And if Slovakia took the decision, which I personally think would be the wrong decision for Slovakia and its own security, to step away from NATO, that would be something that NATO would accept. I repeat, it was the Warsaw Pact that stopped its members from taking autonomous decisions, let alone democratic decisions. NATO does not do that.
So recently there were a lot of fake news spread about the UK also online. Some of them that we found were, for instance, that you're trying to conquer the Arctic. What can you comment on that?
We're not trying to conquer anywhere. First of all, we have to recognize that there is a huge amount of disinformation which is online. A very large proportion of it is produced by Russia.
Sorry, pardon me, but how can you tell that's actually coming from Russia?
Because we have ways of analyzing where disinformation comes from. You often have to follow quite a complex trail. Some of it's very direct and rather blatant, and some of it is working through all sorts of different actors to then finish up as a story that appears in the Western media. But of course, as democracies, you are vulnerable to disinformation. Why? Because you live an open life. You have free media that is free to pick and choose its stories. You hope the media does its job about checking its sources. Sometimes the sources are very carefully and well hidden. But we know that that our media and our countries are under attack. It's often called hybrid war from Russia and others. Slovakia, in fact, is particularly vulnerable in this space, I would say, and has been a particular target. I would say because Russia identifies Slovakia as relatively weak in terms of elements of its media, in terms of the teaching of critical thinking in schools. I think in terms of some of the historical narrative about Slovakia and its place in the world. And also, I think because maybe they identify individuals, sometimes politicians, who would be ready to spread some of that disinformation, not necessarily knowing that it comes from Russia, but because it aligns to a certain extent with their views. Going back to the Arctic, no, we have no interest in conquering the Arctic or anywhere else for that matter. Of course, the Arctic is important for the planet, both from an environmental perspective, and also as we see the Arctic melting, we see efforts by a number of countries, Russia primarily, to militarize parts of the Arctic. Iceland is a member of NATO. Norway is a member of NATO. They, in a sense, have a prime interest in ensuring that that what we will call the northern flank of NATO is safe and secure. But there's no colonization, and as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, we work with our neighbours, those who have particular expertise in that part of the world, to help ensure that the Arctic remains pristine, a continent that is not militarized, and is a continent that remains open for all countries to use.
Mm-hmm. You were talking also about the freedom of the media. Another information we found online that was spread pretty rapidly is that the US, alongside with the UK, control the media, control the narrative, and through shadow forces, decide what will actually be aired and thereby spread NATO propaganda and their own propaganda and some sort of Western propaganda. Is there actually something like Western propaganda, and do you own the media? Do you run it?
So we certainly don't own the media. As I said, in a way, this is for us, I mean, it's a complicated issue because we believe in a free media. So we believe in a responsible media. Media has to be responsible, as any institution has to be, has to act responsibly. I think it's probably fair to say that the success within the media space of, for example, the BBC or US media outlets is not because somehow there's a secret controlling hand. I mean, maybe governments would love to control things, but they absolutely don't. It's because it's good media that people like to listen to and to watch and to see, because it, on the whole, is very impartial. I mean, I think you just have to look at almost any major media story, and you'll see, anyway, plenty of criticism of the United States, plenty of criticism of the United Kingdom, looking at international issues around, say, the Middle East. And that's fine. I mean, perhaps our politicians don't always like it, but they recognize that they have to live with it, because that is the way our societies operate. And I think you look at senior politicians. I remember Winston Churchill, quite famously saying after he lost the election in 1945, after, in a way, he'd been one of the individuals most responsible for an extraordinary victory against the forces of authoritarianism, and yet he was defeated at the election. The Labour Party took his place, and he said, "Well, in the end, I suppose this is what I've been fighting for: the right of the British people to throw me out of office." And I think any politician who believes and understands the values of democracy would understand what we battle for. The reason we come together to protect ourselves is to fight for the right of our fellow citizens to disagree with us, to take a different view, and ultimately to throw us, politicians, sort of out of office. So, no, to say there's a sense of British or American control over world media, I think it's frankly nonsense. And I think people come to media because they trust it. They listen to media, good media, because they trust it. And in the end, the success of a media organisation like the BBC is because people trust it, and they go to it as a source of news that will give them as impartial a view on the world as any organisation is able to do.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And maybe one last question would be also disinformation, let's label it as it is, that was also spread online, that says that the UK is trying to create a standing European army through NATO, and thereby you will be able to force also our soldiers and soldiers of other NATO countries to fight in any wars that you will decide you want to fight in. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, NATO is never going to force a country to go to war on behalf of NATO, or other NATO members can never force countries to go to war on their behalf. It is a voluntary undertaking, the collective Article 5, where we commit to each other's defence. If anything, it's the other way around. When a country like Slovakia joins NATO, it forces us, as the United Kingdom, to be prepared and to make plans to defend Slovakia if Slovakia is ever attacked by any source. Fortunately, NATO has not in its history, has only once in its history had to invoke Article 5, which actually was when the United States was attacked directly during 9/11 by Al-Qaeda. But that is the ultimate guarantee of defence. Of course, there are all sorts of missions that NATO is running and has taken place, but never have NATO members been forced to be part of those missions. And so each time NATO sends a force or provides a mission for defence or security, either within one of its members or out of area. It does so as a group of nations who have decided consensually to come together to do that. There was a lot of disinformation around this question of whether young Slovak men would be signed up to fight in Ukraine, for example. It was demonstrated that was entirely false, and I'm sorry that many people maybe had sort of sleepless nights thinking that they might have to go and do so. That is not the way that NATO works, and that is not the way it will work in the future.
How would you say disinformation affect the relationship between Slovakia and the UK? And let's maybe make this a short response question for like a teaser.
So I think if we don't trust each other, that's where disinformation can work. We have to trust each other and recognize that we work on the same values of democracy, values of fellow members of NATO, countries that believe in the same thing. If we are sure of that, then we can resist disinformation. Let's keep our heads very clear as we do so, and let's not allow our enemies, who are sowing the disinformation, to break us apart. As long as we're sure about our common values, we will remain very strongly together.
Would the UK ever vote for a Slovak Secretary General, or basically the leader of NATO? Is there ever such a chance?
Why not? If it's the best man or woman for the position, then I think we'd be very happy to vote for that person. And I'd certainly very much like to see more Slovaks in leading positions in NATO, both on the military side and the civilian side. So bring us your best people and we'll vote for them.
Thank you very much for the talk.
My pleasure.